an interesting story. New audio tapes from the Apollo 10 mission reveal an eerie experience on the dark side of the moon. Nearly 50 years after the mission, the audio captures when astronauts reported hearing space music. Listen.
What if an astronaut told you he saw a snake slithering through space? Or that Apollo 10 heard eerie music behind the moon, where Earth's signals can't reach?
You hear that whistling sound? Sounds like, outer space-time music. Boy, that sure is weird music.
From Alan Bean spotting something shiny and alien on the moon's surface, to rhythmic knocking on a spacecraft that no one can explain, these aren't science fiction. They're real testimonies from trained astronauts.
And the astronauts themselves aren't sure if that music was caused by those radio frequencies, but they have admitted, or they did admit, they were very terrified by it.
Lights, sounds, and objects where none should exist. So now the question is, are we truly alone out there, or just not paying close enough attention? The sound of nothing. Yang Liwei, China's first astronaut, flew solo aboard Shenzhou 5 in October 2003. During his 21-hour mission in orbit, he reported hearing a sound that immediately broke every rule of expectation. It was not a hum, not vibration, not static bleeding through a headset. He later described it plainly as someone knocking on the body of the spaceship just as knocking an iron bucket with a wooden hammer. The words were careful, physical, and specific, coming from a man trained to describe anomalies without embellishment. The description alone is arresting. Outside the capsule, there was a vacuum. No air, no medium for sound to travel. Inside, every system was monitored, every vibration expected. And yet he heard it. The knocking was rhythmic and distinct, not a single impact but a sequence. It did not resemble random rattling or loose equipment striking the hull. For a solo astronaut, sealed inside a small spacecraft moving at orbital speed, the sound had nowhere obvious to come from. Yang reported the incident after returning to Earth, and Chinese space officials later acknowledged his account publicly. Engineers offered possible explanations rooted in physics. Thermal expansion and contraction of the spacecraft's exterior could produce sharp noises as the capsule moved between sunlight and shadow. Structural stress, shifting materials, or micrometeoroid impacts were also considered. These explanations were plausible, even likely, yet none could be confirmed as the definitive cause of what Yang described. What unsettled scientists was not the existence of possible answers, but the clarity of the report itself. Yang was alone. There was no crew influence, no shared panic, no conversation shaping memory in real time. The experience happened in isolation, documented only through his testimony. In spaceflight, solo reports are rare, and that rarity gives them weight. There was no external audio recording of the knocks, no sensor spike tied directly to the moment, only the account of a trained observer describing something he could not visually verify. Chinese space authorities later emphasized that the incident did not indicate danger or unknown technology. Still, the report remains part of the historical record of human spaceflight. It stands as an example of how even tightly controlled missions can produce moments that resist clear explanation. Not because science failed, but because space environments compress extreme conditions into fragile machines, and human perception must interpret what instruments cannot always isolate. Yang Liwei completed his mission safely and went on to become a national hero. Yet buried within that success is a quieter detail. For a brief moment above Earth, inside a sealed capsule, something struck the hull with an intentional sound. Whether the cause was structural, environmental, or mechanical, the fact remains unchanged. In a place where silence is absolute, something knocked back. Lights in the dark. In 2005, during Expedition 10, Leroy Chiao was commanding the International Space Station as it circled Earth hundreds of miles above the surface. Life aboard the station had settled into routine. Orbits repeated, systems were checked, and the planet below rolled by in familiar patterns of darkness and light. Then, while inside the station and scanning the exterior through observation windows, Chiao noticed something that immediately broke that rhythm. A cluster of small white lights appeared against the blackness of space, arranged in a sharp formation like an inverted checkmark, a clean V shape that did not resemble any known satellite pattern. The lights did not hover or drift randomly. They moved together, gliding past the station with coordinated motion before fading from view. Chow watched closely, instinctively tracking their speed and alignment. From his vantage point inside the ISS, he had a clear perspective of Earth below and the surrounding orbital environment. Everything that passed the station was normally predictable, logged, and familiar. These lights were not. They crossed his field of view smoothly and quickly, then vanished without fragmenting or changing formation. Chow later spoke openly about the sighting, careful to separate observation from speculation. He acknowledged that astronauts often see unexpected reflections and distant light sources from orbit. At the same time, he admitted that the formation stood out. It was not scattered. It was not chaotic. It moved as a single unit. The station's instruments did not register any threat, and no alarms were triggered, but the visual impression stayed with him. In later interviews, Chow stated that the lights were most likely high-altitude fishing vessels, their powerful lamps reflecting upward and becoming visible from space. He emphasized that this explanation fit within known science. Still, he added an important qualifier. The formation pattern was unusual. Fishing fleets could explain brightness, but the clean alignment and synchronized movement were not something he had commonly seen during his time in orbit. That measured conclusion is what makes the account compelling. Chow did not claim anything extraordinary. He did not frame the sighting as unexplainable. Instead, he described exactly what he saw, where he saw it from, and how it behaved. The explanation may be reasonable, but the image remains striking. A trained astronaut watching from inside the International Space Station witnessed lights in formation where none were expected. Even with a logical answer on the table, the moment itself refuses to fade quietly into routine. Floating near you. In June 1965, during Gemini 4, astronaut James McDivitt captured photographs of a strange cylindrical object with protruding arms drifting outside his spacecraft. He and fellow astronaut Ed White both observed the object during the mission, noting its metallic appearance and structured shape. What unsettled NASA engineers was not panic or confusion in their voices, but calm precision. These were experienced pilots describing something that did not match any known spacecraft, booster, or discarded equipment. The photographs were analyzed, yet no definitive identification was ever confirmed. McDivitt later explained that the object appeared solid and controlled, not tumbling like debris. It moved slowly relative to the spacecraft and maintained its shape as it passed through sunlight. White, who would soon perform the first American spacewalk during the same mission, independently confirmed seeing unusual objects during the flight. Both men carefully logged what they saw, avoiding dramatic language, yet their consistency raised concern. NASA explored explanations ranging from ice particles to discarded hardware, but none aligned perfectly with the visual details recorded during Gemini 4. Decades later, similar moments continued to surface in modern missions. While aboard the International Space Station, astronaut Christopher Cassidy reported seeing an object drift past a docked cargo vehicle. Mission Control quickly identified it as a discarded antenna cover, likely shaken loose during earlier activity. Cassidy accepted the explanation, noting that space is filled with remnants from decades of exploration. Still, the brief encounter highlighted how easily unfamiliar shapes can appear alarming when seen against the blackness of orbit. What links these accounts is not a single conclusion, but a shared reaction among trained observers. Astronauts are taught to recognize debris, reflections, and optical distortions. Their survival depends on that skill. When something falls outside those expectations, it is documented, discussed, and scrutinized. In McDivitt's case, the lack of a clear answer stood out precisely because the observation was so carefully made. No fear, no embellishment, just a report that did not fit neatly into existing categories. NASA's official stance has remained cautious and grounded. Most sightings are ultimately attributed to human-made objects, lighting conditions, or perspective effects. Yet the McDivitt and White observations remain notable because they resisted easy classification. They sit quietly in mission archives as examples of how even in a controlled, engineered environment, space can still present moments that challenge certainty, not because they demand belief, but because they were witnessed, recorded, and never fully resolved. The Space Snake. Story Musgrave was the kind of astronaut people trusted without hesitation. He spent years mastering every switch, system, and procedure, and eventually became the only person to fly on all 5 space shuttles. Musgrave flew 6 space shuttle missions between 1983 and 1996 on Columbia, Challenger, Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour, but he never specified which missions included these observations. His reputation was built on careful observation and calm precision, qualities that leave little room for exaggeration. Yet even he carried an account that never fully settled, one he mentioned quietly in interviews rather than formal reports. In a recorded conversation in 1995, Musgrave said that on 2 separate missions he noticed something drifting outside the shuttle that did not resemble any hardware he had worked with. He estimated its length at roughly 6 to 8 feet, large enough to draw immediate attention. The surface appeared smooth and flexible, not rigid or angular. What stood out most was its motion. It did not spin or tumble the way detached equipment usually does. Instead, it moved in a slow, flowing pattern, bending and curving as it passed through sunlight. Musgrave described the sight in the same measured tone he used for technical briefings, offering detail without drama. Despite the clarity of his memory, Musgrave never submitted an official anomaly report to NASA. For an astronaut trained to document even minor irregularities, that absence is notable. Without mission logs, photographs, or other witnesses, the account exists only in Musgrave's personal recollections from interviews. There is no supporting telemetry, no recorded imagery, and no contemporaneous crew confirmation to strengthen the claim. Later interpretations offered grounded explanations. Some suggested the object may have been debris such as insulation, tubing, or seals moving unpredictably in microgravity and sunlight. Materials can behave in unexpected ways once freed from structure. Musgrave himself did not argue against such possibilities. He simply stated that what he saw did not match his prior experience with floating hardware. That restraint is what gives the account its weight. Musgrave did not push for attention or conclusions. He shared what he observed, acknowledged what he could not verify, and left the record incomplete. In a field built on documentation and proof, his story stands as a rare example where reputation is strong, but evidence remains absent. Space music. Apollo 10 astronauts. Thomas Stafford, John Young, and Eugene Cernan expected the far side of the moon to feel isolated, but nothing prepared them for what entered their headsets.
Apollo 10, man's second journey to orbit the moon, was a full-scale rehearsal of all of the activities required to land men on the lunar surface.
On May 22, 1969, as their spacecraft slipped behind the lunar horizon, Earth vanished from reach. No radio contact, no live guidance, only the spacecraft and the vast darkness beyond it. Then a sound appeared, faint at first, then unmistakable. A smooth, rising tone moved through their communication loop. It was not static. It was not mechanical chatter. It carried a drawn-out quality that felt structured rather than random. The astronauts paused, listening carefully. The sound continued, weaving through the audio channel as they traveled behind the moon. It did not spike or collapse like interference usually does. Instead, it rose and fell steadily, almost melodic. For nearly 1 full hour, while the spacecraft remained out of contact with Earth, the sound persisted. The crew had trained extensively on spacecraft acoustics and radio behavior, yet none of them recognized this pattern. The strange melody continued. The sounds were captured on the mission's audio recording system. NASA declassified the audio in 2008.
That music even sounds outer spacey, doesn't it? Do you hear that whistling sound?
Mission Control heard none of this in real time. With the moon blocking all communication, the astronauts had no way to report what they were hearing. Inside the command module, the crew exchanged looks, aware that whatever this was, it was happening far from oversight or immediate explanation. They continued their assigned tasks while the sound followed them, threading through an hour that none of their simulations had prepared them for. After Apollo 10 returned to communication range, the event was logged and later examined. Engineers proposed a technical explanation involving interference between the VHF radios of the command module and the lunar module. According to this assessment, overlapping signals could have produced harmonic tones under specific conditions. On paper, the explanation accounted for the phenomenon, yet the audio itself complicated that conclusion. Those who later reviewed the recording noted that the sound did not behave like common feedback or signal bleed. It maintained consistency and structure, characteristics that made it stand out even among experienced engineers. None of the astronauts claimed it was something otherworldly. Still, their descriptions carried restraint rather than certainty. What unsettled scientists was not fear or speculation, but the fact that trained crews encountered an audio event that did not immediately align with known spacecraft behavior. The incident remains documented, archived, and real. A recorded hour on the far side of the moon where something unfamiliar entered the loop, leaving behind evidence that science can explain but never fully recreate. Shiny shoe leather on the moon. On November 19, 1969, Alan Bean became the fourth person to walk on the moon during the Apollo 12 mission.
You were on the Apollo 12 mission in 1969. You were the fourth man to walk on the surface of the moon. 4 of 12, right?
The terrain around him was harsh and gray, marked by jagged rocks and wide, empty plains that reflected very little light. Nothing about the surface appeared polished or refined. The lunar ground absorbed sunlight rather than returning it, giving the landscape a flat, muted appearance. Yet as Bean scanned the area, his attention fixed on something that did not belong. Against the dull surroundings, he noticed a bright reflection that stood out immediately. It appeared smooth, curved, and glossy, something he later compared to shoe leather. Bean discussed this observation in post-mission debriefs, but provided no photographs of the reflection. At the time, Apollo 12 astronauts were working under tight schedules, and their attention remained focused on assigned tasks and sample collection. The object was never approached or examined directly. Bean later emphasized that it was not debris from the lunar module and not equipment carried by the crew. It appeared separate from anything they brought with them, which made the sighting difficult to categorize. Over the years, scientists and space historians have examined possible explanations. Some believe the reflection could have been caused by a shard of glass formed from a meteorite impact, which can melt lunar material into reflective surfaces. Others point to metallic fragments from earlier space missions or naturally reflective rock faces positioned at the right angle to the sun. Each explanation remains plausible, yet none can be confirmed due to the absence of images or samples. What makes the account notable is not that it defies science, but that it illustrates how limited observation can be in an extreme environment. The moon offers no atmosphere, no weathering, and no familiar visual cues. Light behaves differently there, and objects can appear unfamiliar even when they have ordinary explanations. Alan Bean's report stands as a documented observation rather than a conclusion, a moment recorded by an experienced astronaut who understood the weight of precision. Rather than presenting an unsolved phenomenon, the incident highlights how easily perception can be altered beyond Earth. The Apollo 12 mission returned critical data, samples, and engineering success. Within that achievement sits a brief observation that remains unresolved, not because it lacks reason, but because the opportunity to examine it passed in seconds. What these accounts from space could mean. Across 6 decades of spaceflight, astronauts have reported unexplained observations. Some were later resolved, others were clearly subjective, and a few remain unresolved even after review. Not all accounts carry equal weight. Christopher Cassidy's drifting object near the International Space Station was identified as a discarded antenna cover. Scott Kelly's vivid dreams are widely understood as psychological effects of long-duration isolation, but several cases stand apart because they left physical records or multiple corroborations. Apollo 10's crew captured nearly an hour of unusual sounds on onboard audio systems. Yang Liwei independently reported knocking sounds during China's first crewed mission. James McDivitt's Gemini 4 photographs still lack a confirmed identification. The strength of these cases lies in their documentation. During Apollo 10 on May 22, 1969, astronauts Thomas Stafford, John Young, and Eugene Cernan heard sustained tonal sounds while passing behind the moon, cut off from Earth.
Yeah, it sounds like, outer space-time music. Hey, Tom, is your insulation all burned off here on the front side of your window over here?
The audio was recorded automatically and later archived. When the recordings were declassified in 2008, engineers proposed radio interference between modules as the likely cause. Yet even with that explanation, The duration and consistency of the sound continue to draw attention because it behaved unlike brief static or signal dropouts normally logged during missions. A similar sense of unease surrounds China's Shenzhou 5 mission in October 2003. Yang Liwei, flying completely alone for 21 hours, reported hearing repeated knocking against the spacecraft hull.
October 15, 2003, Shenzhou 5 spacecraft successfully took China's astronaut Yang Liwei into space.
Comparing it to someone striking an iron bucket with a wooden hammer. There was no crew to reinforce the experience, but years later, other Chinese astronauts described comparable sounds on separate missions. No mechanical failure was recorded, and the reports were acknowledged publicly by Chinese space officials without a definitive technical conclusion. Even earlier, during Gemini 4 in June 1965, James McDivitt and Ed White observed and photographed a cylindrical object with protruding arms outside their capsule. NASA analyzed the images but could not conclusively identify the object. Some researchers later suggested space debris or ice particles, but the object's shape and apparent structure kept it from being definitively categorized. Unlike many later sightings, this encounter produced photographs rather than memory alone. What connects these stronger cases is not drama, but restraint. The astronauts involved described what they saw or heard without embellishment. In several instances, they accepted partial explanations while still acknowledging that those explanations did not account for every detail. These were trained pilots and engineers whose careers depended on accurate reporting, not sensational claims. These incidents may represent unfamiliar physical effects, rare interactions between equipment and environment, or perceptual responses shaped by isolation and stress. What remains clear is that experienced observers encountered events they could not fully explain at the time, and in some cases, the records still resist clean classification. The result is not a single conclusion, but a documented reminder that even with advanced instruments, spaceflight continues to present moments that challenge complete understanding. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.